His lecture today, Disclosure and the Social Psychology, the Quest to Identify the New Paradigm. This presentation explores the relationship between the quest to identify the new paradigm, the U.S., and this is important, the U.S. Pentagon's Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, and the To the Stars Academy program. The question that I know Danny will get to right away, is the UFO phenomenon evidence of a threat to our human species posed by extraterrestrial life? Join me in welcoming Daniel Sheehan.
Victor. Thank you, Victor. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to make sure that the presentation I do is a 45-minute one and not an hour and a half one in 45 minutes. That you've been, that all the poor guys, Richard and Johnny and Grant, have been trying to squeeze in their whole presentation in 45 minutes. What I'm going to do instead is kind of edit out some of the stuff that I was going to do. What I was going to do is I was going to have to set the larger context for a narrower conversation. The larger context of this is that this whole discussion that we're having about a new paradigm takes place in a larger discussion about this whole thing. There's a lot of new paradigm discussion going on because everybody is kind of confronted by a period that we're in where there seems to be this lack of respect for truth. That you got Fox News on telling what they think is true. You got MSNBC on telling what they think is true. You got CNN on, and then you've got tons of documentaries taking place on the cable channels. And people are confused now. People are saying, wait a second, it used to be a lot easier when you just had CBS and NBC and ABC, and they were all telling you the exact same thing. Which is, of course, what the government wanted them to tell you. And so there was an air of comfort that people had in thinking that they knew what was going on. They knew that the Russians were bad and that they were trying to take over the world. They knew that we were invading Vietnam to try to protect a legitimate democratic republic in South Vietnam. There was a whole feeling that everybody knew what was going on until sort of when all the lies started being revealed about the Vietnam War. That was the Pentagon Papers case that Victor was referring to, where we ended up getting 47 volumes of top secret internal cables and communiques all about the Vietnam War that made it perfectly clear that one administration after another was just lying about this, and that then the whole investigation came on about the Watergate burglary, which I also happened to have the advantage of being part of. That we represented James McCord, who was the former CIA wiretap specialist that in the Watergate Hotel, who blew the whistle on Richard Nixon. And wrote the letter, John Sirica, and blew the whistle on the plumbers, et cetera. So I've been there all during this kind of strange period where we evolved from a country that sort of believed everything that we were being told about the government until basically, I guess it all started probably with the Kennedy assassination. And it all dawned on us that something was wrong here. It didn't really make any sense what they were saying to us. And so that there was this period when the baby boomers, which I guess a significant plurality of the people here are baby boomers, that when we all started to realize that we were being conned by the government and that they were lying to us. And so that this issue of looking for a new paradigm takes place in this context, that we don't have the luxury any longer of just turning on, the main stations, the network stations, or listening to the government and believing what they say. And so that this has all been kind of thrown up in the air right now. And there's this overlay, additionally, of an entire dislocating of the worldview that we had. That we had a worldview not only that our country was the good guy, helping everybody else in the world, and if we happened to have military troops deployed around the world, it was because we were there to help people with democracy and freedom, etc. And people sort of more or less believed in the churches at the time, and that this whole process has been going on now, where we at least we thought that we could believe in science, that the scientists were telling us things that were true. It was all a basic, simple question of factual proof with scientific experiments and all of that. And then we discovered that there was this whole thing called quantum physics. That not only did they show us that nothing was really real, that you could break down every single element in the universe into smaller and smaller portions down to an atom, and then split the atom, and then you'd have smaller and smaller particles that Johnny touched upon, the electrons and the protons, and then the muons and the quarks and the leptons. And eventually you could actually collide the smallest ones of these together, and they would break down into inchoate quantum fields, which means that there wasn't even any matter there at all. It was just an inchoate, non-materially manifest area that would flash into material manifestation as a wave of energy, and then flash out of material manifestation, and then would flash into existence either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass, one of these Higgs boson particles that was incipient mass. And then we were actually being told that even these particles could, in fact, be at two places at the same time. And that was the last straw. When you got particles of matter that can be in two places at the same time, we actually got to the point where we started to believe in this entire new philosophy of postmodernism, that really there was no real ascertainable truth. And therefore, you had your version of truth, and others had their version, and we had to all be very respectful of each other. And that different people could believe different things, and it was okay. And so that we've gotten into a point now where we have a hard time knowing who to believe or what to believe. And so that there's been this kind of desire on the part of a large plurality of people, the people who actually think, well, actually, let's say a minority, the people who think, that really have been trying to figure out what we can do to try to ascertain and to identify some new paradigm. That's what this whole discussion is about. Actually, here, it's been contexted by all the presentations that have been made so far today, by this quest for a new paradigm that takes into account this phenomenon of UFOs and the extraterrestrial presence. So I want to focus on that rather than going through the whole long discussion of what all the different alternative worldviews are, these competitive worldviews that go on now, that are basically understood by people in terms of the political philosophy of the worldviews that range all the way from the authoritarian worldview to the reactionary worldview, to the conservative worldview, to the moderate worldview, to the liberal worldview, to the progressive worldview, to the utopian worldview. That these are terms that you hear being thrown around all the time of, I don't want to listen to that person, they're just a reactionary, or that person's just a total airhead kind of utopianist. That people categorize each other like that, and they say, okay, that's a worldview that I just don't believe in. And so I'm not listening. And so now you can even turn on your own channel that has your own worldview. And here comes MSNBC. Let's all watch Rachel Maddow and figure out what's really going on. Or let's turn on Fox, because I think they're the ones that are telling us the truth. So that we've actually come to this point now where we're in this postmodern era where people don't quite know what to believe as a worldview. Now, it's in that larger context, which I've just spent a few minutes contexting our conversation about, so that we know that we've got a situation now where the Vatican actually has issued a public statement in November of 2015. Father Jorge Gabriel Funes, who was the director of the Pontifical Observatory, they called together at the Vatican some 40 world scientists and sat down for a whole week at Castel Gandolfo out at the Pope's summer residence and had a discussion about this entire issue of the search for extraterrestrial life. And at the conclusion of that conference, they came together and they made an official announcement, actually at the Vatican. Father Funes said that, look, in light of the fact that the Hubble telescope has been up now, and the Hubble telescope has been able to focus on a particular star at distances and has begun to suspect that there were planets going around these other stars, if you can imagine that. Because up until that point, because of a scientific, logical, positivist worldview, the scientific community was saying, look, we're not sure there are even planets around any other stars. We may be the only solar system in the whole universe where there's actually planets around the star because we can see them. And since we can't see the other ones, we can't say for sure that they're really there. And so it moved from the time with the Hubble telescope, where we could see the intermittent dimming of the light coming from a given star, and they surmised that might be because a planet was coming between us and the star. But then they got the Kepler telescope up, and they got to the point where they could focus it, hold it in place, and focus on one star, and so that they really became more or less convinced that these were planets. And then they got the Planck telescope up, and now they're getting set to put up the Webb telescope this year. And the Webb telescope has the capacity to actually block out the glare of the star, so that when the planet comes around the side of the star, they're going to be able to see the star with their computers and telescopes. And they're going to be able to analyze the potential atmosphere of the star through the planet. They can analyze the atmosphere of the planet. They may even eventually be able to get digital photographs of the surface of these planets. And so I think the church thought that it was probably a time to start having some discussions about this. And they called all the scientists together, and then they held this press conference in which they said that now, in light of the discovery of more and more of these Earth-like planets elsewhere in the galaxy and in the universe, as Johnny pointed out this morning, that they're now estimating there's some 40 billion Earth-like planets in the so-called Goldilocks zone, just in our own galaxy. And that there are probably 500 trillion galaxies. And so that the odds are getting to the point where they had to acknowledge that, look, they said that it's now clear that it's much, much sooner than anyone had previously expected. We're going to actually discover the existence of extraterrestrial life. And so therefore, the time has now arrived for us to begin, as a human family, a serious discussion of the profound philosophical and theological implications of the existence of life elsewhere in the universe. Well, I was the legal counsel for the United States Jesuit Order at their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and so I called up Father Funes and actually went to see him. And within 3 minutes, it was clear that they were talking about another highly intelligent and highly technologically developed sentient species, but distinctly non-human elsewhere in our own galaxy. And so that what I want to do is I want to take the limited time that we have here, of just 40 minutes or so, to talk about how we go about attempting to identify I think this is the nut of the whole question. I mean, all the rest of it is kind of procedural process of trying to say, are they lying to us or aren't they? What have they found? What are they saying? Have people had contact? What are the beings like? What are they saying? What are they asking about? Why are they here? But the bottom line, it seems to me, the bottom line is that what are the full-scale implications for us as a human species if we discover that not only are we not the center of the universe, as we once thought, not only that, but even our sun isn't the center of the universe, but the fact of the matter is that there are other sentient, highly technologically developed species that are distinctly non-human elsewhere in our galaxy, many of which are probably and virtually certainly much more advanced than we, not only technologically and not only intellectually, but perhaps even what we call spiritually, in light of the fact that they've been in a system, for example, with a red dwarf that is less intense than our star, and their planet is closer to their star than we are, but it's been there for like 10 billion more years than we. And so they've had another 10 billion years to explore these fundamental questions. And so that they may well have come to some different type of an insight than we have come to. And up until this point, prior to this conversation, the worldviews that we have, whether they're the authoritarian worldview or the reactionary worldview, or et cetera, all the way down to the progressive worldview or utopian worldview, all of those worldviews, every one of them, are predicated upon the underlying common assumption that we are the only intelligent, sentient being in the whole universe, and that the universe sort of exists as the stage upon which to play out the drama of the human family. And now, all of a sudden, we've discovered that there may be a much different play going on, whereby we may be just a supporting actor. Indeed, we may even have just a bit part or a walk-on. We may be a tree, on the stage. So the question that we have to ask ourselves now is, what is it that we think of ourselves? What do we think of ourselves in this larger context? And so that's the issue I think that I want to address here today in being the last speaker, because everybody has touched upon this issue about the profound impact that this is going to have upon us when people have to come to grips with the reality that there exist many hundreds of other much more advanced civilizations in our own galaxy than we. And how are we going to avoid the experience that has been had by the more primitive cultures that have been discovered on our planet? For example, in New Guinea somewhere in the backwoods of an island, there's a tribe that has never had any contact with the outside world. And as soon as they're, quote, discovered by a much more sophisticated and technologically advanced civilization of our own people, these civilizations fall apart. They discover that their religion has been extraordinarily primitive. They discover that their myths, in fact, aren't true. They discover that their technology is totally replaced by vastly more developed technology, and their whole culture dissipates, and their entire history goes by the boards. So that we're hoping that isn't going to happen to us as a species. But in order for us to prepare to encounter this type of an existence in a larger context, we have to try to answer these profound questions for ourselves. And so what I want to do is I just want to share very briefly with you by way of opening up this question that's been put to us, of trying to come to have a discussion about the profound philosophical and theological implications of our contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. I want to do a couple things. Number one, I want to be able to identify for us, based upon some studies that I happen to have had the privilege of being involved in at Harvard University, what the understanding of the academic community on our planet really is as to what the fundamental beliefs are that go into making up a worldview or a paradigm. So if we're looking for a new paradigm, we have to really understand what are the questions we're going to have to get an answer to that constitute the pieces of a new paradigm so that we can put these together to try to understand what our new paradigm is. That's number one. And number two, I want to have a good idea of what the potential candidates are for such a new paradigm. So those are the two things I want to do in the short time that we have here so that I don't have to rush at 100 miles an hour and have it be like a drink out of a fire hose. So first of all, that I was out practicing law. I'd already graduated from Harvard College in Harvard Law School and was out practicing law for a number of years when I realized that the senior partners in the law firms where I had been and I were functioning on completely different wavelengths. That I had a belief of why I was a lawyer and why I was there to try to help people and make the world a better place. And these other partners had an idea that they were there to make as much money as they possibly could or to get criminals off even though they were guilty. And I wasn't comfortable doing that. So I ended up going back to Harvard, to Harvard University, and doing a master's work, and then to fold into a PhD program on what we call comparative social ethics, to be able to compare and contrast the modes of ethical reasoning that people use to make their decisions about important issues in their life. And what I discovered is that the bottom line is that whenever our human family is confronted by any particular social problem, that what we tend to do is to divide ourselves into different factions. These are the factions that I've laid out for you, from the authoritarian to the reactionary to the conservative to the moderate to the liberal to the progressive to the utopians. There's an octave, a whole spectrum, if you will, or octave of worldviews that we divide ourselves into. And then the people take root in that worldview. And the problem is that almost no matter what you tell them about factual information or evidence, it doesn't make any difference to them. It just bounces right off from them. It's like trying to talk to a Fox News person, about the Sandinista, or try to talk to some person who is an inveterate liberal to try to get them to you're trying to tell them that there's something that Donald Trump has done that might be good, theoretically. So that this piece of information was extremely valuable to us to know that these worldviews exist and that the only way to get a person to be able to hear you who is an adherent to a different worldview than yours is to address their worldview. Because as long as they stay attached to that worldview and you're coming to them from your own worldview trying to share information that you think is pertinent, they don't. So what we discovered is that the underlying a person's choice of a worldview is the answer that they provide to four fundamental cosmic questions. And that is the following. The first of them is what they call the cosmological problem. This is the fundamental question of how the universe came into being. And the second question, fundamental pillar question, is what they call the teleological question, and that is whether the universe is unfolding in any type of consistent, predictable manner, that it's moving from point A on to point Z so that you can understand what's happening, so that you, for example, might be able to comport your conduct in accordance with what your predictions are as to how the universe is unfolding. The third important pillar question is what they call the ontological question, and that is the simple question of how consciousness came into being. How is it that a universe filled with rocks and stars and water and other things, how is it that life actually came into being that is conscious of itself as a separate entity, and that can then exercise control and jurisdiction over a set of a collective of cells that can actually motivate as a whole, as an ontological entity. How does that consciousness actually come into existence? And the fourth and final of the pillar questions is what they call the epistemological question. It's just another big word for what is it that, what are the means that we have at our disposal as human beings by means of which we can possibly answer questions like that? Are we restricted to just our own five senses of what we can see and touch and taste and feel and smell? Is that, or do we have some other faculty? This is a big one. This is a big one because it's quite clear that there's a whole lot of speculation going on now about there existing a sixth human sense, the sixth sense, or an extrasensory perception. All the issues with remote viewing and telepathic communication and levitation and all the different kind of charisms or qualities that are associated with this other potential sixth sense. And are there more? Are there more than just six senses? If we evolve as a species, is it likely that we're going to be evolving additional senses by means of which we may be able to get access to additional data by means of which we might answer these fundamental questions? So these four fundamental questions, these cosmological questions, the cosmological question, the teleological question, the ontological question, and the epistemological question, these are the four basic pillar questions that get posed by any human being, either consciously or unconsciously. And when we come to a certain operating conclusion about what we think about those things, if in fact you have answered each of those four questions in a way that the answer to each of which is internally and self-referentially consistent with the other three answers, then in fact you have a worldview. You have a common principle that is operating underneath the answer to each one of those questions, which principle you can then put into operation when you have to answer the day-to-day problems of the world, of what you do in a given situation, of choosing between option A or B or C. That if you have a fundamental common principle that's answering all those four questions, you apply that principle to these other fact questions, and then you generate an entire philosophy. That is where a philosophy comes from. A philosophy is the general explanation of what the mode of ethical reasoning is by means of which you answer the day-to-day questions that confront a human being during her or his lifetime. And then from that philosophy, there is derivative a political philosophy. That's the one we were just talking about, of the reactionaries and the conservatives and the moderates, and et cetera. There's a political philosophy which is derivative of the philosophy that is generated, and the philosophy is derivative of the mode of ethical reasoning that is generated by the common answer you provide to these four fundamental questions, these cosmic questions. So that having been said, what we're confronted with right now is we're confronted with these people that were referred to starting at the very beginning of the day by Stephen, as these pathological or sociopathic type of people that are complete authoritarians. That they're almost like mentally ill. They're completely egomaniacal. They're totally self-interested. They have no regard for the truth. There is this whole worldview that is rooted in that set of beliefs. And just to do it quickly, it's one of the reasons is because they answer the cosmological question with believing that what's going on, how the cosmos came into existence, they believe that it was just a big bang. And the big bang is sent out all the mass and energy out, expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang. And with entropy, as Stephen pointed out, every single element in the entire universe, on the entire periodic table, all the way up to U-238, or all the way down, every single one of the elements is disintegrating through entropy. It's disintegrating pursuant to its rate of atomic breakdown. Every single element on the periodic table has a particular rate of atomic breakdown. And it breaks down into the lower elements. And then those elements in turn break down further. And so it turns out that there's a process going on of entropy in the universe whereby, pursuant to this first worldview, that the whole universe is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and at the same time, every single element in the entire universe is disintegrating into its smaller and smaller constituent parts until such time as there'll be a point in time when every single element has disintegrated into simply the inchoate quantum fields that make up the muons and leptons and electrons and protons of the atom of that particular element. And the adherents to the first paradigm worldview, they believe at that point the expansion will still continue. And it will continue out and away so that every single irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe, an inchoate quantum field, will in fact just keep extending and expanding out away from each other into the point where there is no thing at all. It's disintegrating into nothingness. Now, that's a bummer, basically. It doesn't give you much chance of hope over the long run. And so that they don't believe that there's any particular reason to be doing anything other than trying to secure their own particular short-term best interests, usually motivated by the highest level of stimulation and self-gratification that they can undertake. And so that becomes their mode of ethical reasoning. That's Machiavelli and the other exponents of that particular mode of ethical reasoning in the world of public policy. That's that particular worldview. The conservatives, or the reactionaries, that's the authoritarians. The reactionaries, on the other hand, just one step removed in toward the middle of the political spectrum, the reactionaries believe that the same thing happens. It begins with the Big Bang and it's expanding all the way on out. But they believe that at the point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe is separate and apart from every other one, at that exact microsecond, that the impetus that was imposed upon them all by the Big Bang will in fact have expired. And the entire universe will just rest at a state of stasis at that moment. And the attraction that every single one of those ultimately irreducible integers of matter has for every other one will then take over. And it'll start attracting them back toward each other. And they will begin to join back together again to eventually form muons and leptons and protons and electrons and atoms and elements and mixtures and planets and star systems and galaxies. And that will continue all the way down, and it'll continue to condense and condense and condense until ultimately every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe will be in direct, immediate physical contact with every other one. Ergo, the universe the size of a head of a pin that you hear talked about by Stephen Hawking and the others. And at that exact microsecond, the polarity will reverse and it will generate another Big Bang. And that this oscillation takes place. They call it the magnum annus, the great year, the eternal return. It's the concept of the oscillating universe, the heartbeat of the universe. And that in between these extremes, there come about certain confluence of mass and energy, which in fact become ontologically united. And that they develop consciousness, which is an epiphenomenon of the actual interplay between mass and energy. And that's all that it is. And that this happens during the expansion phase and in the condensing phase, and in the expansing phase and in the condensing phase. And this goes on eternally. And it's been going on eternally. And there was never actually any origin of this. And it's constant and eternal. And that conscious sentient life evolves in the course of each of these oscillations. Now, they believe, therefore, that it's not just chaos, it's not just disintegration into nothingness. There is, in fact, an underlying dynamic going on in the universe of expanding and contracting, and that the human beings can discern that, and there's an ultimate dialectic that is taking place in the universe. And so that they can find some value in the universe other than just chaos. They, in fact, attach themselves to one side or another. And that they play it out. There's good guys and bad guys, black and white. There's the red team and the blue team. And you can feel this dialectical dynamic, this second paradigm worldview, manifest all around in the culture of watching the blue team play the red team, watching the Boston Red Sox play the New York Yankees, watching the the Philadelphia hockey team play, the Boston hockey team, and it's deep within the human psyche. It's a particular worldview, and this process goes on up as you go across the entire spectrum. You come to the other end of the spectrum, in that there's a belief that is different than that. And what I want to talk about here in the last 10, 15 minutes or so that we've got, I want to talk about this new paradigm. Because we got the old paradigm, we got the authoritarian paradigm, we've got the dialectical paradigm of the war paradigm of good guys and bad guys and war all the time, and vanquishing the ultimate other is the ultimate quest that lends meaning to life, etc. And you got the fourth paradigm, which is the scientific, logical, positivist paradigm, that that you don't believe anything until you can prove it and see it and smell it and taste it, and that nothing else exists, Even if it may exist, it hypothetically exists, but if you haven't been able to measure it and weigh it, you just take a position that you don't believe it exists, okay? But that's the scientific, logical, positivist paradigm of scientism that undergirds the present universities, the academy, most high school teaching and stuff. They believe that science is the answer to everything, and it's the basic root of confidence in the world. It's challenged, as you know now, by quantum physics, as we raised, but they haven't absorbed that yet. They haven't really come to grips with the full implications of quantum physics, the scientific, logical positivists, or the radical materialists. Okay, so the first candidate for the new paradigm that's been talked about for the most part is a new paradigm that takes into account the reality of quantum physics. Okay. And so that there's a sixth paradigm, which is the progressive paradigm that we've been taught minimally, but we've been taught about it all through high school and some college history of Greek philosophy, of Plato and Socrates, and they have what they call the Neoplatonist worldview. It's a radical monist worldview. It's a worldview that believes that there exists inside our universe a bonding phenomenon, this attachment that ultimately irreducible energies of matter have for each other, that attraction that they all have for each other. The degree of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, that whole thing. But that's what draws and holds the universe together into a unified harmonic whole. This is what Plato talks about in Pythagoras and the others. They believe, implicitly, what they believe, it's a secret doctrine, that our human family is evolving a new faculty. It's this sixth sense, this sixth faculty that we have, is able to subtly discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds the entire universe together in one unified harmonic whole. It's just like seeing or hearing, that you can see light waves that have a particular pitch and amplitude. You can hear sound waves that have a particular pitch and amplitude. This magnetic or bonding gravitational force in the universe, they believe, has its own particular pitch. It's very low frequency pitch, but our human faculty is being evolved just like light caused the development of seeing in life forms. It was clearly a tropic response on the part of life to the phenomenon of light to be able to evolve an eyeball that's capable of directly and experientially encountering this particular electromagnetic frequency. Same thing is true with sound. These are faculties that have evolved over time teleologically in response to a particular pre-existent stimulant. And this is what the theory is of the sixth paradigm, radical monist worldview, that is being talked about only as the secret doctrine. It's not been broadcast to the whole world. It's veiled in all types of philosophical opaqueness. But the bottom line is that was what was believed by the radical monists. And so the first candidate for the new paradigm is how do we integrate into the radical monist worldview the traditional progressive worldview that believed in the existence of a unified field and the ability of our human family to discern the unifying phenomenon in the universe or the natural laws that were functioning. And we could thereby collectively and individually make decisions to comport our conduct in harmony with the natural laws of the universe. That's this entire thing you hear so much about natural law. That's the whole theory of natural law that undergirds the sixth paradigm radical monist worldview or progressive worldview, is that there is this faculty. It's a faculty that each of us is endowed with to a greater or lesser degree, just like some people can see better than others, hear better than others. But every human being is endowed with this particular faculty, and therefore each individual is entitled to make her or his own judgments about what human conduct on their part, or in voting, the conduct on the part of our collective, that they think is most harmonious with the natural order of things. That's the underlying and undergirding principle behind democracy, that is the product of the sixth paradigm progressive worldview. Okay, so that what are the implications now of the quantum physics? Because what the fundamental insight is, and I'll be quick about this, the fundamental implication of quantum physics is, as you remember, in quantum physics, one of the things that they've discovered is that when they break down matter into its smallest constituent parts, and they get down to this inchoate quantum field that I referred to earlier, that they can observe the inchoate quantum field manifest in the material realm, either as a wave of energy or a particle of mass, the Higgs boson. But you can't predict which one's going to happen. It does this in such an erratic way that there's no pattern that is predictable as to how a particular inchoate quantum field is going to actually manifest in the material realm, unless you direct human intention to it. And they've discovered this is the all-time earth-shaking, world-transforming insight of quantum physics, is that if you direct human intention to an inchoate quantum field and will it to manifest, for example, as a particle of mass, as distinct from a wave of energy, it will do so to a statistically significant degree. That is absolutely, totally revolutionary. Because what it does is it throws into a complete cocked hat the entire underlying assumptions of the Newtonian Cartesian worldview, the radical materialist worldview, that the physical universe exists out there and that we're here in here. We may have our own subjective thoughts and feelings, etc., but all we can do is respond to the activities of the world, and that we can't have any direct effect upon the fundamental laws of nature. But we can, according to the quantum physics, that if in fact we can, through directed human intention, directly cause a inchoate quantum field to manifest as a particle of mass as distinct from a wave of energy, or vice versa, that if in fact we train this faculty of human intention to a high enough degree, we may actually be able to manifest the kind of qualities that the mutations have done of Jesus, of the Buddha, of the Hindu saints, who can manifest material things. They can manifest material, they can levitate, they can do all kinds of things that has been talked about throughout the ages, and that there's all this talk about these type of people. And what these people are is mutations. They are human beings who have begun to develop and have this new faculty fully evolved, and it is so remarkable that they become notorious in their communities. And people begin to see what they're doing. And virtually all of these people start saying very similar things about how we should comport our conduct, about how the world is unified and there's a natural law in the universe, and we need to comport our conduct in accordance with the natural laws, etc., and be kind to each other, love each other, share our goods, etc. So that this is the first candidate, this one. There's a second candidate which has to do with the seventh paradigm, which is the theistic paradigm. And I want to spend a minute on this, because what we've discovered is our human family up to this point in time under the seventh paradigm have had this whole set of different religious views, but many of the views, especially in Western culture, have projected, well, the sixth paradigm confines itself, the radical monist paradigm confines itself solely and exclusively to what's going on inside the monad. inside the radical monad of the entire physical universe, that is within the confines of the total sum of mass and energy. When you get to the seventh paradigm, they're postulating something about what goes on outside that. What goes on outside the sum total of mass and energy that constitutes the universe? And they postulate an infinite, a completely infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness, which they actually assert is the source of the material universe. That this infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness actually enfolds into being the initial unit of matter in the entire universe. And there's a lot of discussion going on about this. G.W. Whittington has written a number of things about this. There's a whole lot of stuff being written about the initial creative moment, when the infinite and eternal sea of completely undifferentiated consciousness somehow generated the first perturbation in the otherwise unified field of completely undifferentiated consciousness. It generated the original perturbation, or the original discontinuity, which then evolved into the original inchoate quantum field, which manifested either as a wave of energy or one of the Higgs boson particles that was a potential for a particle of mass. This entire seventh paradigm, a theistic worldview, when taking into account all the new discoveries of quantum physics, is going to be transformed into what they call panentheism. It's panentheism is not pantheism, and it's not theism. What it is it's a new understanding of the initiation of the entire universe. That this infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness enfolded into being the material universe, but we as participants in it, by means of the sixth paradigm insights, have a possibility of participating in the creative process itself. That even though the universe has been ushered into being by the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness, we have a co-role with the infinite and eternal consciousness. But in order to make the decisions as to how we're going to direct our intention to try to form the conduct of the universe, the question you have is, what referent are you going to be using to make a determination as to how you're going to intervene in what appear to be the natural unfolding of the universe? What referent are you going to be using? And what the seventh paradigm advocates is that you have to be in a state of unified consciousness with the infinite and the eternal. That if you can, in fact, through meditative practices in dietary disciplines and personal discipline in your life, refrain from overstimulating yourself and overstraining yourself and concentrate on developing this additional faculty, not just the faculty by means of which you can directly experientially encounter the unitive phenomenon that bonds the entire universe into a harmonious whole from within, but actually be able to access the infinite and eternal consciousness that abides eternally, and that you can rest in that particular state of quiestic being, that from that perspective, still incarnate, you can make judgments about the world, and you can advise your fellow human beings as to how we all might conduct ourselves. So these are the candidates within the traditional seventh paradigm worldviews, and so what we have now to face is the eighth paradigm. You know, if we can figure out all of those things and develop those into the highest possible state that we can, the best thinking of our entire human family, how is that going to measure up to beings that may have had another 10 billion years to meditate or to reflect upon the nature of matter and the relationship of consciousness to matter, so that there still remains this potential eighth paradigm worldview. This eighth paradigm worldview in which we have to be prepared for at least putting our best foot forward. We have to at least develop all of our understandings about the seven traditional human worldviews, now updated by quantum physics, primarily in the sixth and seventh paradigm that we've talked about, and be prepared to stand open to find out about the eighth paradigm worldview, that other beings who may have had as much as 10 billion years more to reflect upon these issues and to meditate and to try to develop an ability to be in a state of unitive consciousness in the midst of their incarnation. This is the quest for the new paradigm that we have to be engaged in. But we do not, and we need one final word. We need to understand this, is that the charisms of each of these different worldviews that I've laid out here tend to track almost identically the charisms of the chakras in the human body. Of the root chakra for survival, absolute insistence upon survival as an individual being, as a conscious entity. The second paradigm, the dialectical dynamic of the second paradigm. Each of the qualities and charisms of each of these worldviews, these human worldviews, tend to track almost identically the charisms of the chakras in the human body, the first 7 of them. But the great adepts all tell us that there is, in fact, an 8th chakra above the head of each of us that is right here, where you put your fist up, at the top of the energy shells that are generated by each of the individual 7 chakras in your body. There's an 8th chakra that is there, which may well be the root chakra of an entire next octave of being in the universe. And it is the nexus of our relationship to the extraterrestrial beings. Okay? So this is an extremely important thing for us to reflect upon. It gets us above the fray of, are they still hiding things from us? Is the To the Stars Academy a fraud, or is it just the same old repeat of them doing the same thing again? If we can try to get beyond that and try to focus ourselves on preparing ourselves as a human family to be able to answer the profound philosophical and theological questions that are posed to us by ourselves, by this discovery of the existence of extraterrestrial life elsewhere in the universe, and prepare ourselves for a place at the table in the entire galactic family. Okay, so that's the brief answer to all the questions that we have. That's the 45 minutes, and I guess we have a panel coming up if anybody has any questions about that. Okay? Thank you.
Did you get all that? It's quite the presentation. If you didn't get it all, what has happened? They're over there, right? It's all encapsulated here. What Danny has done is put all the paradigms right across, and then all of the worldviews that way. We have some here. Please don't make a rush to the stage, please. They're here. And you can take one. I would suggest you take it home, put it in your suitcase or whatever, and frame it. Literally, it's really good quality too, as was the present. No, oh, here we go. You see. Anyways, in about 10 minutes, we will be asking George Norrie to come to the stage. I want to thank you very much for your attention. I'll be turning it over to him, and you've been a wonderful audience. And if you're driving the car, get home safely.